Hey guys, Mr. Nichols here. Today we are going to be talking about how to process a crime scene. So this is really our first dive into some of our more specific content that we're going to be talking about in relation to how to perform the tasks of a forensic scientist and a crime scene investigator. So our process is going to be broken down into 7 different parts. So we call this the 7 S's of crime scene investigation. Now, typically this is done in a sequential order. Sometimes there might be some of these steps that are done in a slightly different pattern, but overall, this is the sequence that we want to follow. So first off, we want to secure the scene. Then we want to separate the witnesses. Then we scan the scene, see the scene, sketch the scene, search for evidence, and then secure and collect that evidence. So we're going to go ahead and break down each of these steps so you can apply them to our scenario that we'll be talking about today. Okay, so again, the first thing we need to do is secure the crime scene. Now, this is really important because this is ensuring that no evidence is tampered with, that once a crime scene has been identified, that it is isolated from the surrounding. So we want to make sure that no evidence is destroyed or altered, and we want to make sure that we have a clear vision of what happened and not allow people to manipulate what the evidence might indicate happened at a particular crime scene. So the first responding officer, when they first walk into a crime scene, they're going to first approach the crime scene. Now, when they do that, they're going to survey the area to make sure that, number one, there aren't any other hazards, and they'll identify the different individuals. So they'll approach the scene and survey what's happening at that crime scene. Okay, so then they're going to render first aid. So no matter what's happening in the crime scene, safety is of paramount importance. So we want to make sure that if someone is injured, if there's a potential of someone being injured, or if there's someone who has a weapon, we need to make sure that we are taking care of those issues before we're worrying about processing any of the evidence and isolating the crime scene. So then we need to figure out who is the victims, who's the witnesses, and who are potential suspects. So we need to identify those individuals. Then finally, now we're going to secure the crime scene. So this means we're actually going to be putting up the caution tape to identify the particular boundaries of where that crime scene begins and ends. And then finally, we're going to notify the proper authorities. So depending on what type of evidence is present, we'll need to contact that department from a crime lab so they can send a team out to process whatever type of evidence is present at the crime scene. And also just to call for backup. So if there was a shooting that took place or a murder, there might be someone that's still dangerous that's in that area. So we need to notify the proper authorities to make sure that we can apprehend that person. So, sorry, I failed to mention. So we use this acronym called ARISN to remember these steps. So again, approach the crime scene, render first aid, identify victims, witnesses, and suspects, secure the crime scene, and then notify the proper authorities. That's the initial sequence that we should be following. Okay, so our next S is to separate the witnesses. So witnesses must not talk to each other. As we talked about earlier this semester already, it's very easy for someone's memory to be contaminated by something as simple as a conversation, by watching someone, or just having time take place. So it's really important to make sure that there is no communication taking place between any of the witnesses and any potential suspects. So we also want to make sure that any witnesses or potential suspects are not able to collaborate to make up a story. So that's one of our key strategies for identifying key pieces of information from a suspect is by pointing out inconsistencies between their accounts of what happened with someone else's. So we want to make sure that they cannot have time to align their stories, and that process is called collusion. So it's very important to separate the witnesses. So then we're going to scan the scene. Now, this is kind of our first survey of the actual crime scene once it's been taped off and identified. Now, also during this phase, we'll be figuring out where the photos are going to be taken, and then also where the primary and secondary crime scenes are. So the primary crime scene is going to be specifically the location where the crime took place. Now, this is going to be dependent on where that crime took place. If it was indoors, chances are the crime scene is going to be the walls that are where that in that room of a house or inside of an apartment or inside of a warehouse. Typically, the walls are going to create that primary crime scene. The secondary crime scene would then be an area outside of the primary crime scene where the public is not allowed to enter. So media is not allowed to enter that area. Only licensed forensic professionals and police officers are going to be allowed into the secondary crime scene. So it's very important to separate those two. Now, also, if the crime took place outside, that makes it a little bit difficult to create that primary and secondary crime scene, and it really just depends on the environment. Sometimes you'll have multiple primary crime scenes that are littered throughout an area, depending on the nature of the crime. So then this is also when we're identifying what photos we're going to need to take. So photography is one of the most important tools in a forensic scientist or a crime scene investigator's toolkit. You need to photograph everything that takes place at the crime scene before any evidence is handled or collected. There must be photographic record of what that crime scene looked like before we go ahead and start to process any of that evidence and collect it. So that takes us to seeing the scene. So once all of the areas of the crime scene that will need to be photographed are identified, then we actually take pictures of whatever that evidence is. So we need to be very careful and specific about how we take those pictures. We need to take those pictures with some sort of a scale. So if we look here, we can see that there is a little ruler here next to the object that's being photographed here, which it looks like it might be some drugs of some sort. So it's very important that we have that measurement tool in order to determine the scale or the size of that particular object. If you were to just take a picture of a cut on someone's arm without any sort of measurement tool next to it, it would be very difficult later on to see how long was that wound, what was its size. So we need to take a photograph from far away. So we usually want to say some time or some space that kind of orients that object within the crime scene. And then we want to take a close-up photo. So typically that's going to be from above that object from a 90-degree angle, and then with that scale in there somewhere. Okay, so photography is the most important part of the crime scene investigation process because it is a record of what the crime scene was before any evidence was collected and potentially contaminated through collection. So we need to make sure that everything is photographed beforehand. And that can, unfortunately, if things are not photographed properly, that can cause them to be inadmissible in court later. So if an investigation says that there was a bloody knife at the crime scene, but there's no photograph of it, then that could have been potentially planted there. So we need to have that documentation to prove that it was there before the investigation started collecting items from the crime scene. So we often want to take photos of an object from multiple angles. So that way we can determine where that object was located within the crime scene. And again, we want to, take those pictures from far away, from multiple angles, and then directly above them. Okay. All right, so our next S is going to take us to sketching the crime scene. So oftentimes at the actual crime scene, investigators will complete a very rough sketch. So there are some specific characteristics of our sketches that we're going to be needing to make in here that we'll be doing for this class. So some of these required items will be what direction is north on your sketch. So you need to make sure what direction north is. You also need to note on your sketch where any important objects are. And then you also need to tell the distance between those objects and then at least 2 immovable objects. So if we're inside of a building or a room in a house, we need to measure the distance between an object and 2 of those walls. If we just measured the distance to 1 of those walls, for example, we don't know on that second dimension where that object is. So we need to specifically be able to pinpoint where that object was. So we need to measure the distance between 2 immovable objects. If we're doing this outside, sometimes that can become a little bit difficult. You can use objects like signs or trees as your immovable landmarks, but our measurements must be exact. Okay. All right, so then we also want to generally note any other objects that are located throughout the crime scene. So these are going to be things like doors, windows, if there's certain furniture or vehicles present at a crime scene, we definitely need to make sure that we note those in our sketches. So be paying attention to our directions when we're working through those parts of our activities to make sure that we have everything that we need in the crime scene. So we also need a legend. So typically, it's not good practice to write in the names of each of the objects inside of the crime scene, especially in really small crime scenes that can get really cluttered. So we need to use a legend, or basically a key, to show us what the objects are that are present there. So we also must include the date of the crime, the date that the sketch was made, the time that the sketch was made, and the time of the crime, the location that the crime took place at, the type of crime, and then case number, and then any names. So who created the sketch, and then once the sketch is completed, another person would need to verify it. So typically, a final sketch is going to be made using a computer program to make it a little bit more organized and make it look a little bit more neat for a trial later on. So this is an example of a sketch. So notice how we have these objects here. So object D was a .38 revolver. And notice how they measured the distance between two walls. So now we know exactly where that object was. So notice how they've noted where north is. They've shown the location, the date, the time, the dimensions of the room, and then also various objects around the room in addition to the body of a victim here. So if you look really closely at this, you can see that both points are pointing to one spot on that victim's head. So we need to make sure that we're choosing the exact same point on an object to measure those distances. Okay, so you wouldn't want to use one part on their head and then another one on their foot. There's a pretty large difference in distance between their head and their foot. So we want to make sure that we're using the exact same point there. So you're welcome to use this as a reference when we go through and do our sketches later on. Okay, so that takes us to our next S. So that is searching for evidence. Now, once we are trying to search for evidence, we need to use a specific pattern, a specific method that's going to match the layout of that particular crime scene. So this ensures that we find any piece of evidence that might have not been found in the initial scan of the crime scene. So oftentimes we can use things like vacuum cleaners to pick up small hairs or dirt particles. We can use flashlights and forceps to pick up things that are really small, and then also looking for other types of trace evidence there. So these are our different types of typical search patterns that would be used. So if you look here, we have the grid pattern. So the grid pattern essentially, and oftentimes this will be done with multiple people. So we have basically one person walking in straight lines, and then another person walking in straight lines in a perpendicular fashion from that person. So that way we've covered every space within that room. So then we also have the inward spiral. So this is when we're going towards the center of the room, and we walk around in a spiral pattern. So that way we're touching basically every section of the room. And same thing, we can do an outward spiral as well. Basically the similar pattern, but except it's moving outward. Now, for much larger crime scenes, so oftentimes these will be things like a field or a warehouse, you can have a line of investigators and they'll basically walk along in a straight line, and that's called parallel. So it's really important that if you're going to use this or any of these patterns, that you're very careful to make sure that you find any evidence on the first time through. Because once you've walked through an area, you have now contaminated that section. So you need to make sure that we're very careful so we're not having to repeat those lines of motion to search through that crime scene. And then finally, we have a zone. So zone typically means that it's a crime scene that has multiple different areas. So there might have been a shooting that was in an apartment building. So you have the primary apartment as one of the areas. You might do a spiral pattern or a grid search inside there. And then there might be a field that was outside. So then that separate area will have a different type of search pattern. So a zone is just for a more dynamic crime scene where there's multiple different areas that have multiple different requirements for searching. Okay. And then we're going to take us to securing and collecting the evidence. So securing the evidence basically is how we are making sure that it does not get contaminated. So for this, we need to make sure that we're storing it in the proper type of container, which we'll talk about that here in a second. It needs to be sealed properly. It needs to be labeled properly. And it needs to make sure that whoever is collecting it is wearing proper protective equipment. So if you look here in this picture, notice this crime scene investigator is wearing gloves. They're wearing full body PPE, and they're also wearing a face mask as well. So this is incredibly important because it's very easy to contaminate a sample with your breath and with your skin cells, with your hairs from your body. So we need to make sure that all of that is contained so we are not contaminating that evidence. For example, if you picked up this cigarette butt here with your bare fingers, there is a chance that you could leave some of your DNA or even your fingerprint on that cigarette butt. So it's very important that we are not contaminating that evidence. And this is also something that we'll talk about later on when we're referring to a lot of TV shows and movies. A lot of TV shows, if you go back and watch them, almost no one is wearing PPE. You're lucky if they're wearing gloves. Most of the time, almost all evidence that they collect in TV shows and movies is contaminated. So that's something that we'll talk about more later on. So the biggest thing when we're trying to collect evidence is we want to try and keep it in as much of its original condition as possible. So if, for example, we have a shirt that has some hairs and some blood on it, rather than collecting those collecting those hairs or collecting that blood sample, we just collect the entire shirt, just put that inside of a large paper bag and then seal it and then take it to the lab and we analyze it in a much more controlled environment. So it's very important that we only store one piece of evidence per container. We don't want to mix different pieces of evidence in the same container because, number one, that can break or damage that evidence, but it can also contaminate it. So we want to make sure that we're storing each item in a different type of container. Okay. All right. So typical ways that some typical tools that we'll need to use. You will need to use forceps if you're picking up small items. We do not want to pick them up with our fingers because that can damage them. Our fingers are not as precise as forceps would be. So we also want to store any type of physical evidence that is not biological. So these are going to be shards of glass, bits of plastic, hairs that don't have a follicle attached to them, any type of fibers from clothes, trace evidence. Those are all going to be stored inside of a small plastic pill container. Now, if we have liquids that are found at the crime scene, which oftentimes these are going to be for like flammable liquids, we're going to collect those in airtight, unbreakable metal containers. So we want to make sure that those liquids are not evaporating. Now, here's some pictures of each of those. So forceps for picking up small items, plastic pill bottles for containing small bits of evidence that we want to make sure that they don't get damaged. And then finally, those airtight metal containers. Now, again, that's only going to be for liquids for our examples in here. Okay. Now, the biggest and most important piece of collecting evidence, put a big star by this in your notes. If it's anything biological, blood, semen, skin cells, it needs to be stored in a breathable paper container. So I'm going to say that again. Anything biological, blood, semen, anything that has DNA in it must be dried and stored in a paper container. So we need to make sure that we do not store anything biological in plastic. That's the biggest thing that can cause contamination, and that can cause evidence to be completely thrown out of a case. So biological evidence needs to be air dried and then stored in paper. So that can either be in one of these little paper bags or what we call a paper bindle, which is essentially a specific way of folding a sheet of paper, and then it's sealed so that it can be stored for analysis back at the lab. Now, the last little piece of processing a crime scene that we're going to discuss today is called the chain of custody. So the chain of custody is basically a way for us to ensure that no one tampered with evidence between where it was collected at the crime scene, brought into the lab, analyzed, and then sealed again, then passed back along to the police officer, and then brought back into the courtroom. So it's very important that there is no unauthorized person who had access to that evidence. And if there was a questionable thing that happened to that evidence along the way, there is documentation to see who had access to it and when. So the chain of custody log for every piece of evidence must include the case number, the item inventory number, the description of the evidence, the name of the suspect, the name of the victim, the date and time of recovery, the signature of the person recording the evidence, and the signature of any witnesses that were present during collection. So the chain of custody is incredibly important for maintaining the integrity of evidence so it cannot be thrown out in a court case. So this is a quick little image of what a chain of custody log will look like. So again, this is what we call continuity of possession, meaning that every person that came in contact with that evidence is documented on this sheet here. So if there's any lapse in the chain of custody, that evidence can be thrown out. So it's incredibly important that this is maintained throughout the entirety of an evidence process of being collected, processed, and then brought into the crime scene, brought into the courtroom. So, and then finally, once we have done all of these different steps, now it's time for the evidence to be analyzed in the lab. So oftentimes this is going to be taking place by a specialized technician. So someone who only works with DNA, for example, or only works with reading rifling marks on bullets, or only collecting fingerprints. Oftentimes, crime labs are going to have a specialized task that they are going to do basically over and over and over again. So oftentimes, these individuals will need to testify in the courtroom about any evidence that they might have collected and their methods as well. So our goal in all of this process is to try and recreate what happened at the crime scene by analyzing that evidence. And what we're trying to do in reconstruction, and this is what we're going to be doing in our activity during our lab activity this week, is we are going to be trying to reconstruct what happened at a crime scene. And essentially all that is it's a hypothesis or an educated guess of the narrative or the sequence of events, the timeline that took place at a particular crime scene when that crime actually happened. So when we're trying to reconstruct it, we're trying to build a timeline using that evidence. So that is all we have to talk about here today for our 7 S's. Again, if you missed something, please feel free to go back. You can feel free to rewind the video and just make sure that you complete the processing the evidence activity for this week. So if you have any further questions, feel free to reach out, and I hope you all have a fantastic day, and we will talk to you guys soon. Take care, everybody.